It was August 2005. I was the executive director of the Washington Animal Rescue League in Washington, D.C. It's an animal shelter that I built, completed building in October of 2006. In fact, I was renovating the facility at the time Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. So while we were renovating this shelter, Katrina came along, and I was putting in a good 16 hours a day. I was putting in a good 12 hours a day at the Washington Animal Rescue League, running the organization as well as overseeing the construction. And when Katrina hit, the Humane Society of the United States immediately started mobilizing or attempting to mobilize, and I had been part of their DART program, and I immediately put a team together and we deployed. I think it was the second day or the first day we were actually allowed into the city to start rescuing. And at the time I had been rescuing animals for 15 plus years. As a humane officer, I was the director of the New York City Animal Shelter. I'd spent some time in India setting up shelters and protocols and policies and training people. I was the captain of humane law enforcement in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I'd experienced a lot, and I'd seen a lot in my career. In fact, I thought I'd seen almost everything. That is until our vehicle pulled up to the checkpoint, the first checkpoint in New Orleans. As we slowly came up to that checkpoint, our team, we saw these cars lined up on the side of the road. We looked at the cars, then we looked at the people, and the people were looking at us. Out of all the vehicles in that line to go through the checkpoint, they were staring at ours. And I couldn't understand why. And then they started rushing our vehicle. And as they rushed it, I rolled the window down, and suddenly we started getting hit, bombarded with pieces of paper. And as I opened up these pieces of paper, I found a key inside each piece of paper with the name of the person, their cell phone if they had one, their address, and the description of their animals that were trapped inside the house. These people were on their knees with tears streaming down their faces, begging us to go in and save the lives of their animals. And it was at that very moment I knew this was uncharted territory, and I'd never experienced anything like it. And as soon as we entered the ravaged city, it was obvious that there was a major catastrophe here. Just within blocks of entering the city, we were being flagged down by the National Guard and pedestrians trying to tell us where animals were trapped. Yet we had already had a stack of papers of calls to respond to that people had already called in and reported that their animals were trapped. And of course we received all of these keys and addresses from the people on the side of the road, and now as we're entering the city there's more. And that's pretty much how the next 6 weeks went. You just couldn't catch up, and time was certainly against us. You'd come up onto a block, an address that you had, and you'd go in and you'd get that dog or cat or whatever the animal was that was trapped inside that house out of that house. And while you're in that house rescuing that animal, floodwater being in the house still, you're hearing more animals next door and down the block and up the street and around the corner. And you really just parked your van on one corner, and we loaded that vehicle up in 30 minutes. And it was a problem. I mean, there were more animals than we could rescue. And for the first time in my career, I had to pick and choose whose life I was going to save today. And I had never experienced that before. There were animals on roofs, animals trapped in houses, animals on dry land, and pretty much the priority to us became the ones that were trapped in these houses, because we knew the temperatures in these houses. We didn't know what was going on in these houses. We knew there was still floodwater in most of them because it was still very early on. Whereas the ones on the street and the ones on the roofs were able to fend hardly, but fend a little off the elements a little bit better than the guys trapped in the houses. So we focused on them. We would load our van in a short period of time, and unfortunately the emergency shelter was a good hour and a half outside of New Orleans. So we made several trips throughout the day. It was a real waste of product. It was not an efficient operation early on, and it took days, if not weeks, till it finally did become efficient. So we worked a good 20 hours a day, solid. The 4 hours of trying to sleep at some point just wasn't really worth it, because you weren't sleeping. You were having nightmares about what I saw throughout the day, but what I wasn't able to get to. My head would race. So, obviously rest was important, but it was very difficult to rest. And adrenaline is an amazing thing, and it can keep you going for a very long time. And all of my team members learned that firsthand. I mean, we ran for a good hard 6 weeks straight. And it wasn't until I got off I got onto it. We had been down here doing amazing things, seeing animals in unbelievable situations, and saw a lot of death and saved a lot of lives. Saw a lot of human death as well. So I had a fundraiser to go to. I'd been here 6 weeks. It was time to get back to my organization, but I was flying straight into a fundraiser that we were having to actually fund all of our work here in New Orleans. And so, the idea was to go to the fundraiser and get a suit on and tell some heroic stories and raise a lot of money. It's not at all what happened. When I got on that plane, and when I left New Orleans and I got on that plane, walked into the airport, sat on that plane, it was at that very moment that I just realized what I had gone through. And I broke down. I mean, just the blood rushed to my feet. And I was a mess. I mean, I was a real wreck. And I couldn't control my emotions. Everything that I had denied myself of for the past 6 weeks bubbled to the surface. And next thing I know, I'm getting in a cab in DC, getting ready to go to the Hotel Monaco to run this fundraiser, and I was in no condition to speak. So I got there and I just called my board aside and broke down, told them that I was in no position to speak, and enjoyed the evening. But reality was, that reality was very different than my reality at the time. So it took some time to get back to normal life. But I didn't want to. I mean, I certainly didn't want to let go. There were still issues down here. So I think I stayed home for just under a week with my kids and my wife, and came back down and continued to provide some resources to the community for the years to come. I mean, we would come a couple times a year to pull animals out of some of the shelters here, because we built a lot of relationships, had a lot of resources. We became a massive resource to some of these shelters. The shelter problems here were significant long before Hurricane Katrina even came along. So very high kill rates in many of these shelters. So we came in and on a regular basis and pulled animals that were slated for euthanasia and brought them back to DC. Our team rescued nearly 1,000 animals. I remember each and every one of those stories. There are a few that obviously are very close to my heart, and one of them was early on. It was probably, I think it was the 12th of September, and as I said, we were working 20 hours a day. They wanted you in before it got dark, but man, there was just way too much suffering going on to go back and relax and eat and talk with people. So we stayed way past curfew, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, I think, on September 12th, and we were driving through. There was a food service for emergency responders set up in the French Quarter. And they even started making veggie burgers for us because all my team members are vegans or vegetarians. And so it became a regular place for us. We actually started eating well. And as we were leaving there, a police officer had pulled us over. And I figured, we were past curfew. He was going to ask for my credentials, or he was just going to simply send us back to the emergency shelter. Instead, with a tear in his eye, he told me that he had been on the clock ever since the storm hit, and he couldn't leave his post. And he had gotten his family, his kids and his wife out of New Orleans prior to the storm, but not his animal family. And he had 3 dogs, and he lived in the 9th ward, and his 3 dogs were trapped. And he pretty much assumed they were dead because we all know how much water hit the 9th ward. But he did have a 2-story home in the 9th ward. Anyhow, he asked us if we could go check on his dogs. And I said, certainly. So he took his address, and off we went to the 9th ward that evening, or that morning. And but we also knew that we probably couldn't get to his house because there was still a significant amount of water over there. And so we parked where we could, and then we figured it was going to be I think it was about a 12-block walk to try to get to his house. And obviously at each block we'd probably inherit several more inches of water. And sure enough, by the time we got very close to his house, the water line was up to my chest. But I felt we could do it. And we got there, we got to the house, and we had to climb up and bust in through a window. We got in, and as we searched the house, I saw 1 dog floating. Mind you, we had 3. And then I knew at that moment there were no survivors in this house. And then I found a 2nd dog floating. And then I heard some noise in a room. And I went into that room, and it didn't make sense that I was hearing noise. It was a little spooky, actually, because the water was high. And I walk in that room, and there was a dog perched on a 2-inch windowsill and alive and very happy to see us. And he likely had been perched on that 2-inch windowsill for several days. And we got him. And to reunite that dog with a man who was sworn to serve the public was a great honor. So one thing that I did, which was very effective, is when I went into a house to rescue an animal, it wouldn't take long to find a piece of paper that would get me a phone number that would eventually get me to the guardian of that animal. Usually no more than 2 calls, sometimes as many as 5. But I was able to talk to for the most part, I was able to talk to the guardian of the animal that I was rescuing in almost all of our rescues within minutes after rescuing the animal. And that became a very unique and interesting part of my job, because not only was I rescuing animals, I was the first person in someone's house. I was their lifeline. I was the first person to tell them what they had lost or what they hadn't lost. And I would say the large majority of the time, they pretty much assumed they lost their house, but the only thing they cared about was what kind of shape their animal was in. So that became another great honor. What a privilege it was to be that for these people, these families, and I took that role very seriously. They had evacuated, or 400 people had evacuated New Orleans to Washington, D.C. The D.C. Armory, it's a massive structure in D.C., had housed 400 people. And out of those 400 people, 2 people had gone on the D.C. news saying that their animals were still trapped in New Orleans. And of course, my staff called me and said, "Scotlund, you've got to get these guys their animals." I said, "Of course." So we were able to, while we were down there, rescue the animals of the people that were relocated in DC. And we were also able to take some of the shelters, animals that had been surrendered, nearby shelters, back to DC. So we brought a lot of animals back to DC for adoption just post-Katrina. But to reunite these two gentlemen with their animals was in DC was pretty remarkable. Unfortunately, the dog, the Lhasa Apso, that we reunited Mr. Peel with had passed about a year after Katrina, and we adopted him a new dog. And Wayne Mancuso, who he was featured in a couple television programs, we got his cats, Simba and Darji, brought him his cats, and he was displaced for several months. And then he finally went back to New Orleans, flew his cats out with him, and then he passed. Mr. Mancuso passed a year later, and his dying wish was that his animals be returned to the Washington Animal Rescue League and placed up for adoption. So I think that was the 1 or 2 year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and we came back and got his cats and brought them up and got them new homes together. You know, when you're sleeping on a tree trunk, not having bathed in weeks, next to a lot of people who are experiencing the same thing you are, an incredible bond occurs, like it or not. I mean, in many cases, bonds that you would never in a million years form outside of a major catastrophe like Hurricane Katrina. But these bonds were built and they're unbreakable. I mean, these are the people these are the only people that can relate to me, and I can relate to them in regards to the experience here. You know, not even my wife or my kids or my closest friends back home can relate to me the way these perfect strangers
Did you find yourself, when you got home for the first couple of months, actually interacting with everybody else on the outside who'd done this, as opposed to family and friends and close people back home? I mean, did you find it hard to interact with your wife and kids and spend more time talking with people out in the field?
You know, not so much. I mean, at the time I was the executive director of the shelter, I had some massive responsibilities, and I was, you know, I had about 50 staff members or so, and out of that 50, I used about 20 of my volunteers, brought them down to Hurricane Katrina, and I used about 6 of my staff. So obviously I became closer to those staff members and volunteers than others. And perhaps in the early weeks after we returned post-Katrina, I spent more time with them and certainly could talk to them a little easier than perhaps others. But I also had the responsibility of my recovery and their recovery, and actually put everybody through compassion fatigue sessions. I am truly honored and considered a great privilege to be in the position that I've been in over the past 20 years. I mean, I have led the rescue of hundreds of thousands of animals in some pretty significant cases. I mean, certainly Hurricane Katrina. As the executive director of the Washington Animal Rescue League, I took in the Michael Vick dogs. You know, they were declining greatly at the Virginia shelter that they were in. And, you know, they had to await several months until the court proceedings, so I was able to take them in and start their recovery process. You know, I've shut down an unprecedented number of puppy mills and animal fighting cases over the years. I've learned from everything that I do, and I continue to learn. And again, I'm now the president of an international animal protection organization, and I wouldn't be qualified for this position had I not had so many incredible experiences in my life protecting animals, including Hurricane Katrina. When I left Hurricane Katrina, it was time to get healthy again and get a different state of mind and start recovering, start the recovery process. And I did. And as the year went by, I tried to keep Hurricane Katrina at a distance. And a year and a half went by, and I reminded myself that when I was here during the floods, or during the storm, I had told myself that I needed to paint what I saw, because I'm an artist, I paint. So a year and a half had gone by, and it was time to bring Hurricane Katrina back into my life. And I did that through, so I can process more, and I did it through painting. And I started painting the animals that I had rescued and focusing on their eyes, the despair, the fear, the terror, and the hope in their eyes. And suddenly I, for the first time, realized that I actually was a pretty good artist. I had never thought of myself as a good artist, you know, an artist that could actually show or sell his work, until I started painting these images. And as I would paint these animals, I would relive the moment with that specific animal and pretty much cry through the entire painting. And it was an incredible moment, incredible process. And I was painting, you know, I was finishing the painting in 4 to 6 hours. Just once I started, I didn't stop. And I couldn't stop painting. I just kept painting more and more. And next thing I know, I've got this whole huge series of Hurricane Katrina paintings that I had started selling. And I had a big art show. Carol Guzzi has become a dear friend of mine. She and I had a joint art show along with an evacuee from Hurricane Katrina. We had this show at the 2-year anniversary in Washington, D.C., and it was a huge success and raised a lot of money for the Washington Animal Rescue League. And I've been painting animals that I've rescued ever since. But just this past week, I got myself back into, I brought myself back to Hurricane Katrina and started a painting. Probably the most emotional Hurricane Katrina painting I've done to date. When I was in the 9th Ward rescuing animals 5 years ago, I had fished an American flag out of the 9th Ward. I got caught up on it. I reached down and pulled out an American flag, and I took it back and I said I was going to paint on this flag. So this past week I started that painting. I had a massive 4-foot by 6-foot canvas that I had stretched onto wood that I had pulled from a dilapidated building in New Orleans. And then I attached the flag to the canvas. And then I had mixed my paint pigment with actual flood water that I had taken back with me from Katrina. And I spent all of this past week reliving Hurricane Katrina as I created this painting, and I'm quite pleased with it.